Brian McLaren is an author, a speaker, and a theologian. And he's identified 4 different zones that he says most religious people find themselves in when it comes to issues of sexual orientation or homosexuality. And the first zone is to promote violence against and stigmatization of gay people in the name of God and religion. Now, you may not be in this zone, but you can probably use your imagination for not very long at all to see others in our world who are in this zone. The second zone is to oppose violence, but uphold the stigmatization of gay people in the name of God and religion. So this group says, well, of course we oppose violence. This is always bad, but we really don't want the gay community in our community. We really don't want them to be a part of us. Then the third zone says, to oppose violence and seek to reduce stigmatization of gay people in the name of God and religion. So this group would say, yes, of course, violence is wrong, and we want to reduce the stigmatization. We actually want the gay community to feel comfortable in our community. That we want them here, but we may not let them be full participants, or we may not give them leadership positions, but we want them here. And the fourth zone says, to oppose violence and replace stigmatization with equality in the name of God and religion. So the question for us this morning is, which zone are you in and why? Where do you find yourself in the story? Now, there's also a more pressing question for us, I believe. Because you see, I may be in a different zone than you, and you may be in a different zone from the one sitting next to you. So the question for us becomes, can we be in different zones and still walk together as Christian community? John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, in a very moving sermon, said, if your heart is right, then give me your hand. And that's the question, right? If your heart is right, then let's hold hands and do this together. So I want to ask if you're willing to please raise your hand. If you love someone, maybe that's a family member or a friend, but if you love someone who identifies as gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender, could you please raise your hand? And keep your hands up and look around the sanctuary. Sometimes we need to be reminded that we are not alone. And you know, people have asked me over the last few weeks, why is this issue important? Issues of sexual orientation or homosexuality, and should we be talking about this in the church and worship? And so allow me to just give a few reasons of why I think this is exactly the right time and right place. Did you know that when it comes to our LGBT youth, they are 4 times more likely than their straight peers to attempt suicide? When it comes to our LGBT youth, they are twice as likely to be bullied in school. 4 out of 10 of them say that when it comes to their own communities in which they live, they don't feel accepted, they don't have a place to belong. The Barna Research Group did a survey a couple of years back. They surveyed 16 to 29-year-olds, completely unchurched, no church affiliation. 91% of them said that the phrase anti-gay accurately describes present-day Christianity. Something tells me God welcomes the conversation. And so I want to begin the conversation by sharing with you my story of how I shifted zones, how and why I shifted zones. And I think most of you know that I was raised in a pretty conservative evangelical Christian culture. And it wasn't just my family, or it wasn't just my friends, or my church, or my youth group. It was the whole culture. It was the culture that I was embedded in. And you see, we lived and died by this saying, love the sinner, hate the sin. You may have heard of it. And you see, when it came to the sin of being gay, it was no greater sin than the other sins. It was right up there with lying and cheating and stealing and adultery. But the truth is, for us, it was just the grossest of the sins. You see, I can imagine lying and cheating and stealing, adultery. But the romantic touch of another man, couldn't imagine it. And yes, when we peered into the gay community, it was all about the sex. They were just hypersexualized beings. We didn't know them. You see, in this phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin, it worked just fine for me until about midway through my college career, when one of my best friends came out of the closet to me. He said, "Well, you know, right?" I said, "No, man, I don't have a clue what you're talking about." "Come on, man, you know by now, don't you?" "Man, I'm clueless. What are you talking about, Trey?" I was so naive. He said, "Well, I'm gay." And in my mind, what I said is, "No, you're not gay." Man, I have prayed with you. I have worshiped with you. I've sat in church with you. We've shared meals together. I know you. You're not gay, because you can't be gay and be Christian, and I know you're Christian. And you see, the thing is, no one wanted to be straight more than Trey. He asked me to pray with him and for him. He asked others in our dorm to pray with him and for him. And we prayed for months. And we were certain that God was going to fix this, heal him of his sickness, cure him of his disease, if only Trey would surrender enough. And months went by, and Trey was still gay. In fact, the only thing that might have changed was the amount of shame we placed upon him, and guilt. And you see, he made this really bold and courageous move. He felt bad enough. He went down to focus on the family and spent months in reparative therapy. And after months, he came back. And the thing is, nothing changed. He was just as gay as when he came in. And he started saying things like, "Well, maybe you just can't fix things that aren't broken." But you see, it was hard to see my friend go through this kind of pain. Losing family, friends, having a community turn on you. And you see, after a while, you just start thinking, God, either you're just kind of cruel, or there's another way to understand this. And you see, during that same time, I found myself in kind of a bad living situation, and I needed a place to live. And I was at the gym that morning, and I ran into a buddy. And I just mentioned in passing, I said, "Hey, man, I need a place to live. If you know of anyone looking for a roommate, keep me in mind." And he called me later that evening. He says, "You know what? I've been down in my basement. I only come down here to do the laundry, but I've been down here cleaning, and it actually looks pretty nice, and there's a bed down here, and if you want the basement, it's yours." And I said, "Sweet." And I moved in the very next morning. Now, here's the thing. I had had a gay friend by this point, but I had never lived with someone who was gay. Now, he's still, to this day, a very dear friend of mine, and so we can laugh about this now. But on the day I moved in, I had all sorts of fears and stereotypes, and I was thinking to myself, how wild is this going to be? Like, how wild are his parties going to be? And what will I be walking into in the living room? And how many random guys will he be bringing home at night? And let me tell you, it got absolutely wild. Here's how wild it was. He was in bed every night before the 10 o'clock news started. He was awake by 6. He went to the same coffee shop every single morning. After that, he went to work. And after work, he went to the gym. And after the gym, he came home. And he talked to his dog, Roosevelt, in all sorts of weird and silly ways. The ways that I now know are the same ways I talk to my children when I walk into the door. It was absolutely off the hook. Some nights, he would even go to Rockies games with friends. And on Sunday mornings, he went to church. And sometimes I would walk in on my friend, and he would be reading the scriptures and reading books about church and culture. And I should also tell you, he was a pastor, a dang good pastor. He loved his people, preached good sermons, was very, very creative. In fact, he married Tammy and I 10 years ago next week. I didn't know all the backstory when I moved in, but our friendship was deepening, and he was telling me the story. See, he started a church here in the Denver area, and this church grew. It grew to be the largest young adult church in America. Every Tuesday night, over 3,000 people gathered for worship. But you see, some on a leadership team found out his sexual orientation, and this was an evangelical church, so you can imagine how the scenario ended. He wasn't there for long. And you see, you can only hear so many stories from your friends, so many stories of the heartache before your heart starts to ache. And I started asking questions. Why would anyone choose this? Why would anyone choose to lose family and to lose friends? Why would anyone choose to lose communities, to lose the church, the people whom you've loved and pastored? And you see, what I was realizing was this love the sinner, hate the sin stuff wasn't working. Because I could no longer hate fundamentally who you are and in the same breath try to love you. It wasn't working. It made my heart all torn. It made me feel distant from God the Creator, not closer. And I wasn't so sure it was a sin anymore. I wasn't so sure these people were against God and God was against them. But see, I still had this major problem. As an evangelical, as one who was rooted in a love for the Scriptures. And by the way, I still have the same love for the Scriptures, but as one who was rooted in the Scriptures, what do I do with all those seemingly anti-gay Bible passages? And you see what I did? I saw that I had to reread them. And as I was rereading them, I started reading people who were rereading them. And did you know there's only about 5 or 6 passages that even remotely mention this, so that we've used to stand against the gay community? And these same scriptures that allowed me to hate the gay community, these are the same scriptures that liberated me from my hate and my bigotry. So I want to walk through them with you really, really quickly this morning. Genesis chapters 1 and 2, it's the early creation stories. And you all have probably heard that cute phrase, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And here's the thing, when you read Genesis chapters 1 and 2, you see that this has nothing to do with sexuality. This has nothing to do with these kind of earthly relationships. This is about ancient Israel standing in the midst of creation, standing in awe and saying, how did we get here? And how do we tell the story to our people that God did all of this? How did we get here? Now, when you start asking that question, you know that biologically there's only one relationship that creates us, and we won't need to go into details here. But the question had nothing to do with sexuality. The question was, how did we get here, and how do I tell that story to my people in the ancient world? But then, see, you get to Genesis chapter 19. And you have the story of the destruction of the city of Sodom. And here's how at least I heard the argument growing up. The city of Sodom engaged in homosexuality. Therefore, God destroyed the city and all its people. But then you go back and you reread this story. And you reread before the story and what happens after the story. And you say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Here's how the story goes. God is really, really angry with Sodom. God sends these 2 men to proclaim judgment. They're later called angels. But they go into Sodom, they stay at Lot's house. Lot is Abraham's nephew. It's late at night, the first night, and the men of Sodom start pounding on Lot's door, and they say, we want those 2 men. We want to know them. They wanted to rape them for means of power and domination, to show who is really in control of this town. Lot says, no, you can't do that. These are my guests. Here, take my 2 virgin daughters. Now, how come that's not the talk of the text, but homosexuality is? Long story short, the city of Sodom is destroyed. Lot's life and his family, they are spared. See, homosexuality, God destroyed them. No, God was sending the men there before this happened. So we got to go back and see, why was God angry at Sodom? Now, when we read Amos, Ezekiel, and Isaiah, we see over and over the sin of Sodom. Sodom was filled with pride. They trampled on the poor. Jesus mentions the city of Sodom twice in the Gospels. In Matthew chapter 10 and again in Luke chapter 10, same story. He says Sodom was a city severely lacking in hospitality. Don't be like them. The sin had nothing to do with homosexuality. It's not in the text. But then you get to that really obvious Bible verse, don't you? In Leviticus, man should not lay with another man as with a woman. If they do so, this is an abomination. If they do so, they should both be put to death. But then you start looking at the context of, where is this in Leviticus? This is in the middle of the holiness code. There's lots of laws in Leviticus. And the holiness code tells these ancient Israelites how to be a separate people, to remember their separateness, remember their holiness. Don't be like the Canaanites. Now, if you're an ancient Israel and you're telling this story and you see yourself on the brink of non-existence, yourself and your people, what's the best remedy for this? Procreation. Have more children. This keeps you going. By the way, do you know what else is an abomination in Leviticus? Shellfish. Eating shrimp. Why? Because a shrimp doesn't know its identity. It doesn't have scales. You know what else is? Wearing clothing of mixed materials. Why? It doesn't uphold our separate identity. It's a confused identity. Deuteronomy chapter 20. If a woman is found to not be a virgin on her wedding day, we should take her out in the streets and stone her to death. Which laws do we want to live by, and what does that mean for us? But see, then you get to the New Testament, and you get to the Apostle Paul. Once he says in 1 Corinthians and again in 1 Timothy, these list of vices, these list of things that won't get you into heaven, the kingdom of heaven. Some translations use homosexuality, other translations, the NRSV uses male prostitution, and here's the context there. Paul had zero context for monogamous homosexual relationships that we know today. What was happening in his context was, in the first century Greco-Roman world, people were going into the temples of the gods, and it was very common practice for older men to be preying upon young boys and to be in sexual relation with them, and Paul says, stop it. Don't do this. This is about pederasty and sexual molestation. This, of course, is condemned. And then again, in Romans chapter 1, you have this chapter that's all about the problem of idolatry, and it has nothing to do with sexuality, but it talks all about how the unnatural and the natural and how these things work. And again, Paul's context here is about rituals of worship. And they're going into the temples of the gods, the temples of the deities. Heterosexual persons are engaging in homosexual acts. And Paul says, don't do the unnatural. Don't be given in to the ways of the pagans. Don't be like them. And when some of my gay friends read this text in Romans, they give a big amen. Of course, Paul, we're right with Paul. Don't engage in the unnatural. See, for me to try to be heterosexual is unnatural, and I'm not going to do it. You see, what I found in rereading the scriptures was that when it comes to the Bible, it is by and large silent on this issue. And when we start reading the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we see a Jesus who says nothing. In fact, when it comes to Jesus in the Gospels, he's going around and he's always talking about how to give life to people. how to give abundant life to people, good life, eternal life, how to do this. And in John chapter 10, verse 10, he says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. The context here is Jesus is the good shepherd. But you see all around him, when you read the Gospels, all around him, there are people, some of them Jesus followers, who are obsessed with labeling. And they are obsessed with telling you who's in and who's out, who's clean and who's unclean, and who God accepts and who God doesn't accept. And Jesus says, no, that's not the way. In fact, we're going to go to them. We're going to go to them and we're going to sit with them and we're going to get to know their names and we're going to share meals together. It's why in the United Methodist Church, the communion table is open to all people because we realize that it's not our table, it's God's table. And at this table, you are offered life. When you receive the bread today, you'll hear the words, the bread of life. And for those who are 4 times more likely to attempt suicide, do we hear Jesus saying, I came that they may have life. And for those who are twice as likely to be bullied in school, I came so that they may have life. And for the 4 in 10 who say they're not accepted in their own communities, that they don't belong, I came that they may have life. And for my friends who are still rejected and kicked out and pushed out, I came so that they may have life and have it abundantly.